Well, I just finished Resident Evil 8 Village last night, and I absolutely loved it. Now I'm in the mood for some scary village stories, so I've selected a few allegedly true stories that take place in villages, which can be defined as a settlement situated in a rural area smaller than a town. Let's see what horrors await us. And unlike the player character in Resident Evil 8, we can't just slap an appendage back on after some mythical beast lops it off. So if something sinister finds you in your village, it's likely game over. Enjoy these stories. Now let's begin. I live in a city with my mom and my younger brother. We own 4 shops in my village, which has now basically started to develop into a small town. The city in which I live is 25 miles away from it. My father often visits us every 2 or 3 days, as it can be difficult to commute daily. We have a huge bungalow in the village where my uncle, aunt, and grandparents live with my father. My mom, along with my younger brother, settled in the town 15 years ago from our village for my education. So whenever we have festivals or celebrations, we have to travel back to our village a few days prior to the event. Well, I was in my village one night. It was late, around 10:30 p.m. I had to drop my other cousin off at his house, which was about 5 miles away from ours. So I took my scooter instead of my sports bike, since it was much more comfortable to drive, after my stomach was full from a great feast we had. There were 2 roads for us to take to reach his house. One was the normal street, where vehicles drive very often, while the other was a shortcut, but it was pebbled and not maintained well. There were often some strange and paranormal sightings on this road, according to the local villagers, and the forest surrounding it really gave off a spooky vibe. Since my cousin and I had a great interest in ghost stories and legends, we decided to go down this shortcut road. It was a full moon night, so the only lights on the road were my headlights and the moonlight. We started telling some scary stories to each other. Settling into the eerie atmosphere, we soon made it to his house. My uncle and aunt were asking me to spend the night, as it was already late, but I'd have to be in the city early in the morning, so I couldn't stay. As I left their house, I asked them not to worry too much, since I would call them as soon as I made it home. I began to make my way back. I decided to use the same pebbled road. As soon as I began to drive down the road, a chill went through my spine, which startled me. It was like my instincts were telling me to turn back. I shook off the feeling, then I put in my headphones, playing music from my phone. It soon began to sink in, despite the headphones, that I was alone and the surrounding forest was creepy. When I would turn and have to have my back turned towards it, it felt as if something was about to tackle me from behind. I ignored this sensation as best I could and drove another 2 miles. Suddenly, I spotted a woman walking on the side of the road. She looked completely normal, and as the village was just a mile ahead, I thought she would be bothered by me offering her a lift, so I drove further ahead of her. After driving further, I saw the same woman walking ahead of me, which made me anxious. I thought to myself, how could someone walk or run so fast without me seeing them pass me by, even though she had been right behind me on the same road? I began to panic a bit, so I sped up. Now here's where it gets really creepy. I don't know why I looked in the rear mirror of my scooter, but when I did, I'll never forget what I saw. It was the same woman, except now she was running after me. I was terrified, so I began to accelerate even more, and yet she was still gaining on me. The faster I went, the more she gained. What scared me the most was when she was chasing me. Her hands were stretched forward, and her nails looked horrifically sharp. For a moment, as I stared at her through the mirror, the shadows of the nearby trees broke, and the moonlight revealed more of her. That feeling of fear and helplessness grew. She had extremely pale skin, eyes pure white, and just a black spot in the pupils. Her teeth were extremely sharp, like some sort of predator instead of a human, and her mouth was wide open, more than humanly possible. She wore a pure black dress. Just looking at her chasing after me like that, my eyes went teary from the sight. I was glancing a few times in the mirror when I then saw her get down on her hands, now running on legs and hands like an animal chasing prey. At that moment, I thought I was going to die, but still, with all the adrenaline pumping inside me, I drove to the max speed my scooter would allow. I stopped looking back, trying to focus on driving and getting away. After a few minutes, I don't know how, but when I finally did look back again, she was gone. When I exited that road and reached my village, I slowed down and stopped near a police station, which was just at the start of the village. Seeing me with such desperation and a frightened look, the officer patrolling at the time asked me what happened. I wanted to speak so badly. I wanted to tell him how happy I was to see him, but not a single word came out. Instead of speaking, I looked back one last time to make sure the woman was really gone, but my jaw dropped at what I saw. I shivered, my eyes wide open. That woman was standing right there at the start of the road, as if she was unable to cross it. She gave me a smile so wicked, as if she was telling me she had fun chasing me that night, that she was glad I was there to entertain her for the night. Slowly, she backed and faded away into the dark forest. The officer asked me again and again, but still not a single word came out. The officer took me home. When I made it home, I felt a warm and cozy feeling come over me, and finally tears began to roll down my eyes. I was so glad and felt so fortunate to be alive, to be home. When my family saw me in such a state, instead of asking about the situation, they just sat me down on the couch. Eventually, I calmed down a bit, and I explained the situation, which I cannot believe or didn't even know how to comprehend. To my surprise, they all believed me and were much relieved knowing that I wasn't harmed. My grandparents then told me that there were a few recent cases in the village about people seeing a woman on that road, chasing down whoever walked or drove on it, but never actually harmed anyone. The next day, I came back here in the city. It's been 2 days since the incident as of writing this. I still feel so lucky, and I can't help but wonder what would have happened to me if the woman had caught me or if my scooter had broken down. I know one thing, I'm safe now, but I won't be able to visit my village anymore, at least not for a certain time. My mother had arranged for one of my cousins to pick me up from the international airport in Manila during my last visit to the Philippines. Being Filipino myself, it seemed like every time I returned to visit my parents' native years, I'm introduced to hundreds more cousins and relatives, which I never knew I had. I had never met this cousin, whom I'll call Juan, who came to pick me up on a warm, tropical evening. It was near midnight, but Manila was still alive with the lights and sounds and hustle and bustle of a crowded metro city. My cousin Juan, a slender young man sporting a military-style haircut, picked me up in an older model van, and after tossing my baggage in the back, we began the long and slow trip out of the city. I was on block leave from the Army, having just returned from a deployment to the Middle East, and I came to the Philippines to relax and to get away from all things United States military. As we made our way slowly through the congested midnight streets, still filled with shoppers, vendors, tourists, and partygoers, my cousin asked me what I do in the U.S. Army. We had a good 5-hour drive to where I would be vacationing near the beaches. I told him that I served as a platoon sergeant in an artillery unit. I'm also known as the Chief of Smoke, or simply Smoke. My cousin Juan got very excited to hear this. As it turns out, he was also an artillery crew member in the Philippine Army, and he anxiously invited me to visit his artillery unit before my vacation was over. Naturally, I accepted the invitation, as I was anxious to see my fellow Filipino 13 Bravos, that is the U.S. Army designation of an artillery soldier, in action. Yeah, I came to the Philippines to get away from things that go boom really loudly, but I couldn't pass this up. Towards the end of my vacation, my cousin Juan again picked me up, all dressed and looking tactical in his Philippine Army battle dress uniform, and took me to the base. I was very excited to see how the Filipino artillery units operated compared to the way we operated in an American artillery unit. For one, I noticed that the Filipino battle dress uniform was pretty modern, resembling our own American uniforms with a similar digitized camouflage pattern, much like the ones our U.S. Marines wear. Their equipment loadout was also basically the same as ours, with modular load-bearing vests for ammunition pouches, grenades, first aid kits, and water, while their individual weapons ranged from 5.56 caliber M16s and M4 rifles with the designated sharpshooters armed with the 7.62 caliber M14 rifles. All in all, I judge the individual Filipino artillery soldier to be just as motivated, competent, and professional as the best soldiers that served in my unit. My only disappointment was with the old equipment that the Filipino artillerymen were using. Their main artillery gun was the old American M101 105mm towed howitzer. Having retired from service with the United States military, the M101 first saw service in 1941 and was now considered a museum piece by most of the Allied countries which used them. But the M101 howitzers still soldiered on with the Philippine military. And in fact, the artillery piece which many of these young soldiers operated were the same artillery pieces which their fathers operated, or even their grandfathers before them. In addition, their methods of emplacement and laying the gun battery or setting up the firing unit, then positioning the gun tubes to fire on the enemy, hadn't changed much since the 1960s. On average, it took 15 to 20 minutes to get the unit into position, set up artillery shells, and fire at the enemy. By contrast, the modern United States military, using sophisticated GPS, satellite, and target acquisition systems, could set up, acquire the enemy target, fire and destroy the enemy, and leave the firing position in a fraction of the time. I was issued a Philippine military vest with body armor and a Cavalier helmet, and I accompanied the unit to the field, where they set up to fire a battery of 4 howitzers. Given the fact that they were issued ancient equipment and were using outdated fire procedures, the unit still performed admirably with what they had, and were able to put steel on target as quickly and as accurately as was possible. The unit commander was an air assault qualified officer, we'll call him Captain C, who was justifiably pleased with his firing battery. From emplacement to rounds impacting on target, the unit averaged only 10 minutes. This was a remarkable feat, given the equipment they had to work with. Later in the day, we returned from the field to the main base, where the unit cooks served the soldiers a meal of a curry made with goat, a soup made with noodles, and a type of Vienna sausage, and a generous portion of rice. After lunch, the soldiers began the task of cleaning and doing maintenance on their howitzers. I took that time to walk around the huge concrete bay where the unit held their formations and admired the many pictures, banners, and citations that the unit earned which decorated the walls. One picture in particular caught my eye, and I had to do a double take to ensure what I was seeing was real. The picture was taken inside that very bay, with 6 soldiers standing side by side in front of a wall. The soldier in the middle I recognized as being Captain C, although at the time the picture was taken, he was a lieutenant. My cousin Juan was standing to the far right. What was shocking was that mounted on the wall above the 6 soldiers was a giant wing. The wing was colored dark gray, almost black, and seemed to be covered in a coarse fur. The wing was withered and resembled that of a bat, only it extended beyond the 6 soldiers standing underneath it. Assuming that each of the soldiers took up 2 feet of a standing space, I would estimate that the bat-looking wing in the picture measured about 14 feet long. Not wanting to take any soldier away from their duties, I waited until later in the evening when the unit's first sergeant, Gonzales, and several other sergeants invited me and my cousin out for dinner and drinks at the base and CO Club. Over a plate of grilled steak kebabs and a nice bourbon on the rocks, I asked First Sergeant Gonzales about the curious picture that I saw in the bay. To my surprise, they talked about how they acquired the wing as nonchalantly as one might describe their morning commute to work. This was the story that was related to me that night. Back when Captain C was a lieutenant, the unit went out for about a week of training in one of the more remote islands in the southern part of the Philippines, where suspected insurgent fighters were said to be operating. It was a heavily forested area with several mountains and hills where almost anything could hide. The unit made a base camp in a clearing about 2 miles from the nearest village and began conducting artillery training, firing rounds into an uninhabited impact area which had previously been cut out of the dense jungle. On the 4th day of training, the village leader and several farmers came to the base camp and demanded to see Lieutenant C. The village leader accused C that his men had stolen several chickens and a goat from the village the night before and demanded repayment. Immediately, Lieutenant C formed his unit and a thorough inspection was conducted. The unit first sergeant said that no soldier left the perimeter last night and no evidence was found of the missing chickens and the goat. Despite this, Lieutenant C gave the villagers as much rice and canned goods as they could carry, as he did not want any troubles with the local population who could have been sympathetic to the rebel insurgents. However, late the next day, the village leader returned and again accused the soldiers of stealing. This time, more goats and chickens were missing, with many chicken coops smashed. Lieutenant C again protested the innocence of his soldiers, assuming that the village leader was just using that as an excuse to get more free food from the soldiers. However, Lieutenant C agreed to send First Sergeant Gumpolis and 5 other soldiers, including my cousin Juan, to the village to investigate. The 6 soldiers, along with the village leader, were loaded onto 2 military trucks and driven back to the village. Once there, the soldiers could feel a tension in the air, and the village of roughly 200 inhabitants was clearly on edge. The first sergeant radioed back to Lieutenant C at the base camp that indeed many chicken coops were smashed, and the pen which held the goats was also destroyed. Lieutenant C radioed back, telling First Sergeant Gonzalez that the perpetrators may be rebel insurgents and that they may be trying to make the villagers hateful of the soldiers. The captain warned the soldiers to be careful and watch for any signs of insurgent movement, when all of a sudden a scream echoed throughout the village that alerted the soldiers. A young woman crying hysterically ran from a small home and into the arms of the village leader. It took a few moments to calm the young woman down as she screamed and pointed back at her house made of bamboo and thatch. In the native language, she cried over and over again, saying, "She's gone, she's gone." It took her. The young woman turned out to be the village leader's daughter, and the person missing was her newborn little girl. The Filipino soldiers raced to the rear of the hut to find a huge hole torn into the back of the thatch wall where the baby was apparently sleeping. On the ground, the soldiers found evidence of claw marks. Whatever had done this had done it only a few minutes before the soldiers arrived. First Sergeant Campales radioed back to the captain, explaining the situation as well as his intention to look for the baby. Lieutenant C, cautious that it may be a trap to lure the soldiers into the forest, told them to stay put until more soldiers could arrive. However, Juan had heard the sounds of a crying baby somewhere in the distance, seeming to come from deep in the forest. It was getting darker by that time, with only about an hour of daylight left. First Sergeant Campales again radioed the lieutenant, pleading with him to allow them to search for the infant before it got too dark. This time Lieutenant C agreed, but ordered them to remain in constant contact with the base. The soldiers plunged into the forest, trying to follow the fading sounds of the infant. Since this was only a training mission, the soldiers were armed with only 1 magazine for their rifles, containing just 5 rounds. The faint sound of a crying baby was combined with the sound of giant wings flapping, which at times seemed to go silent, as if whatever was flying had settled in the trees. To their northeast were steep hills shrouded in dense vegetation, and to the west was a wide river which flowed from north to south. For a moment, the flapping noise and the rustle of tree branches seemed to be coming from the soldiers' east, meaning that whatever it was now heading towards the hills. The soldiers had already been running through thick and humid jungle for about a mile, scanning the treetops and listening for noise. But after a while, the flapping noises ceased and the jungle became quiet again. The soldiers stopped in the thick jungle, forming a perimeter, and listened. They were at the base of the hills. 3/4 of a mile to the west was the river. The soldiers were sweating and tired, having had to maneuver around the vegetation and fallen trees in their desperation to find the infant. Once again, it was Juan who heard the crying. Somewhere on the steep hill above them was the faint sound of a crying baby. As the sun crept lower and lower over the horizon, the soldiers began ascending the hill, grabbing roots, vines, and branches as they pulled themselves ever upward. Though completely exhausted, the further up they climbed, the louder the cries of the baby. They finally came to a somewhat level ground where the baby could be heard only a few dozen meters away, though they could not see her due to the incredibly thick vegetation. Suddenly they were met with a sound like rushing water, and a monstrous something with hideous black wings breaking through the dense foliage. Juan got the best glimpse of the thing, describing it as standing roughly 5 feet tall, with the face which looked to be a combination of an old hag and a bat. It was covered in dark fur. This was the only good look that the soldiers got of the entity, as the rest of them only saw a dark shadow as it passed overhead. Climbing over a small rise, the soldiers emerged into a small clearing to a shallow cave. Around the cave were the carcasses of half-eaten raw chickens and goats. Also within the cave, in what can only be described as a nest of straw, scrap cloth, and dead foliage, lay a little baby girl. Her thin clothing was ripped, and she had suffered several scratches and appeared too tired to even cry anymore. First Sergeant Compales immediately scooped up the baby girl in his arms, comforting the baby as she coughed and whimpered. All of a sudden, shots were fired as the soldiers began firing down the hillside. First Sergeant Compales rushed over to see what his soldiers were shooting at. The thing was now gliding downwards, away from the hill and towards the river. "If it gets across the river, we won't be able to track it again," yelled Juan. The thing sat down on the top of a thin strand of trees less than a mile away, apparently injured by the shots fired from the soldiers. First Sergeant Compales handed the baby over to Juan, then grabbed the radio from one of the other soldiers. "Fire mission! Fire mission! Fire mission!" he yelled back to the artillery base. One round, shell, high explosive, fuse, airburst. At this point, Lieutenant C could have questioned First Sergeant Compales as to why they were firing outside of the designated impact area. He could have also questioned why they were firing an airburst, an artillery round timed to explode in the air. But he did neither, trusting in the judgment of his combat-experienced first sergeant, and ordered his unit to execute the fire mission. "Shot out," yelled Lieutenant C into the radio as one M101 howitzer belched smoke and fire. Meanwhile, the thing was half walking, half crawling towards the deeper woods, flapping its wings again as if to fly. The soldiers up at the cave held their breath as the creature disappeared into the woods, followed by an explosion in the trees 50 feet above, where the thing vanished under the vegetation. Just as the last fading rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, a dark shape emerged from under the smoke. A scream eerily human-sounding came from it. The black shape attempted to flap its wings as it attempted to cross the river. Instead, all that could be heard was a loud splash. As soon as the soldiers returned to the village, they quickly brought the baby girl back to the base camp, along with the village leader and the greatly relieved mother. The medics examined the baby girl, cleaning and bandaging her wounds. Despite being a bit dehydrated and scratched and bruised, the baby girl would make a full recovery. Lieutenant C filed a report with the battalion command and assigned a squad of soldiers to watch over the village for a few days, but nothing more unusual occurred. Over the course of the training period, soldiers returned to the village to help repair the damage to the chicken coops and the pens which held the goats. They also repaired the home of the little baby girl, whom the soldiers nicknamed Lucky Star. The display of artillery gunnery of First Sergeant Compales was nothing short of spectacular, as hitting a moving target with just one round was amazing. 3 days later, fishermen fishing the river found the wing washed up on the shore and brought it to the soldiers. The soldiers eventually brought the wing back to base and mounted it on the wall, but the thing began to shrivel up and stink as it was exposed to constant daylight. So a day and a half later, the soldiers took it down and burned it, and that was that. Still, the nonchalant way they described the incident fascinated me, as if this was just one aspect of life being a soldier in that part of the world. For their part, the Filipino soldiers were just as fascinated by my apparently nonchalant description of being surrounded by thousands of terrorist insurgents when I was on an isolated base in Iraq only a few months earlier. The Americans faced ISIS fighters, but But these Filipino soldiers faced big creepy Batwoman monsters. No big deal either way when you got artillery on your side. This story is a short one. I mean really short. Basically, I used to live in a small village in Roscommon, in Ireland. The village was called Scramoag. My mom and my sister went to Longford to do the weekly shopping. They would sometimes make me come with them. However, that day they allowed me to stay home. My mom said she would be gone for about 3 hours, which for her meant 6. About half an hour into my stay at home alone, I began feeling uneasy. I have some mild paranoia, so this wouldn't mean much. When I say mild, I mean that if I heard a sound, I would stop what I was doing and look around for about 2 seconds, then I would resume whatever I was doing. Anyway, I was sitting in my bed feeling a bit uneasy. Then the blinds in the bathroom beside my room began shaking. This spooked me a lot. I shouted something along the lines of, "Who's there?" When no one responded, I called myself an idiot, which basically means idiot. The window was open, of course it was, so I got up to go close it. The reason I wanted the window closed was because wasps seem to love flying into rooms that I'm in, and I hate wasps. I went into the room, but the window was closed, so the blinds shaking was not caused by the wind. This idea scared me, so I just hoped that the rattling sound came from the video I was watching. About an hour passed without much incident. Then I heard something else. I heard footsteps coming from upstairs. Then there was a knock at the door. I practically jumped at the door. Luckily, it was just some friends coming by to see if I wanted to come outside with them. I threw on my shoes and I ran out the door. I've not experienced many more incidents since then, or before then for that matter. Now, some people hearing this story might just say that the footsteps were also my friend's footsteps. But I was on the first floor, which is the second to Americans. The door was on the ground floor, and the footsteps were in the attic. Definitely not the sound of my friends coming to the door. Plus, the footsteps sounded like they were hitting wood, not tarmac. For a while, I tried to convince myself that it was just my friends too, but that doesn't make sense to what I heard. Thanks for listening. Well, that brings us to the end of today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Remember to stay safe out there because this world is full of strange and terrifying things. If you like and enjoyed these stories, then hit the like button, press the notification bell, and subscribe for more spine-tingling content. And we will see you in the next story.